provoke you, or hurt you. Even negative attention reinforces their psychological centrality in your life. This is what is often referred to as narcissistic supply, the steady stream of reactions that stabilize their shaky internal world. When you go silent, especially emotionally silent, that stream dries up. There is no outrage to feed on, no defensive speech to twist, no visible pain to validate their power. Your lack of reaction disrupts the reinforcement cycle they are accustomed to. Without that feedback loop, they experience something deeply uncomfortable, a drop in perceived control and importance. Silence also removes predictability. If they cannot anticipate your reaction, they cannot script the interaction. Narcissistic patterns thrive on repetition. Provoke, react, dominate, reset. When you refuse to participate, the pattern collapses. This creates internal agitation because their sense of self is externally regulated. Without supply, they must face emotional emptiness, insecurity, and instability they typically avoid by extracting reactions from others. Silence creates psychological destabilization for a narcissist because it disrupts the control structure they unconsciously depend on. Individuals with strong narcissistic traits, especially those aligned with narcissistic personality disorder, as outlined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, often rely on external reactions to regulate their internal emotional state. Their stability is not self-generated, it is co-regulated through dominance, validation, or emotional impact on others. When you suddenly withdraw your emotional responses, their internal equilibrium starts to wobble. They are accustomed to knowing how to pull your strings. What triggers you, what makes you defend yourself, what makes you cry, what makes you chase. That predictability gives them psychological security. It reassures them that they are powerful, relevant, and in control. Silence removes that reassurance. Without feedback, they begin to experience uncertainty. Uncertainty for someone with narcissistic traits feels like threat. They may start questioning whether they are losing influence. They may obsess over what you are thinking. They may monitor you more closely, check your social media, or attempt indirect contact. This is not casual curiosity. It is anxiety-driven vigilance. Destabilization also occurs because silence interrupts the narrative they tell themselves. Narcissistic personalities often maintain a grandiose self-concept. I am desirable, I am superior, I am unforgettable. When you disengage calmly and consistently, you challenge that internal script without saying a word. Your non-response communicates indifference, and indifference contradicts their need to feel exceptional. Over time, this destabilization can trigger escalation. They may intensify charm, rage, guilt, or manipulation to restore balance. The more grounded and regulated your silence becomes, the more exposed their dependency on external control feels to them. They escalate tactics when ignored, because silence threatens their access to control, and when control feels threatened, the response is rarely calm. In dynamics involving strong narcissistic traits, especially those consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, as described in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, escalation is a regulatory strategy. It is not random behavior. It is an attempt to restore dominance and emotional supply. When you stop reacting, they first test subtly, a casual message, a just checking in, a reminder of a shared memory. This phase often looks harmless, even nostalgic. It is commonly referred to as hoovering, an attempt to suck you back into engagement. If you do not respond, the tactics intensify. The charm may turn into urgency. The urgency may turn into accusation. Suddenly, you are cold, immature, or selfish. This is projection. They attribute to you the very instability they are feeling. If that still does not provoke a response, they may escalate further into triangulation, involving friends, family, or even social media to create indirect pressure. The goal is not resolution. The goal is reaction. In some cases, escalation takes the form of rage. Not necessarily explosive rage at first, but controlled hostility, sharp comments, passive-aggressive remarks, subtle threats to reputation. The nervous system of someone dependent on control does not tolerate emotional starvation quietly. They push harder because silence creates psychological discomfort, and discomfort demands discharge. Escalation is an extinction burst. When a behavior that once worked no longer produces results, it intensifies before it weakens. The louder they become, the clearer it is that your silence is disrupting the system they relied on. Your silence shifts the power dynamic because power in narcissistic relationships is rooted in emotional leverage. When someone operates with strong narcissistic traits, particularly patterns associated with narcissistic personality disorder, as outlined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, control is maintained through reaction management. They study what moves you, what wounds you, what makes you defend yourself. Once they understand your triggers, they use them to steer the interaction. When you argue back, you are still participating in their structure. When you over-explain, you are still trying to earn understanding from someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. Even when you protest unfair treatment, you are signaling that their opinion holds weight. That weight is power. Silence removes that weight. When you stop explaining, stop correcting lies, stop reacting to provocations, you quietly reclaim authority over your emotional responses. You are no longer negotiating your worth inside their narrative. Instead of orbiting their moods, you become internally referenced. That shift is subtle, but it is profound. Power shifts because unpredictability enters the equation. If they cannot predict your emotional response, they cannot script the outcome. If they cannot script the outcome, they cannot dominate the exchange. Silence introduces ambiguity, and ambiguity reduces their sense of control. At the same time, your nervous system begins recalibrating. You are no longer in a reactive loop. You are observing rather than absorbing. The more consistent your silence becomes, the more stable you feel and the more destabilized they feel. Control in these dynamics was never about volume or force. It was about who could provoke movement in the other person. When you stop moving on command, the balance quietly tilts. They rewrite the narrative to regain control because silence leaves vacuums, and narcissistic personalities do not tolerate vacuums. When someone with strong narcissistic traits, particularly patterns consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, as described in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, loses direct influence over you, they often attempt to regain indirect influence through storytelling. If you are no longer reacting, arguing, or defending yourself, they cannot control you in real time, so they control the narrative instead. This may begin subtly. They frame your silence as cruelty. They tell others you are unstable, dramatic, or emotionally unavailable. They may claim they tried everything, and you refuse to communicate. Notice the inversion. Your boundary becomes their victimhood. Your calm becomes their evidence of your supposed coldness. Narrative rewriting serves several psychological functions. First, it protects their grandiose self-image. Accepting that someone disengaged because of their behavior would require accountability, and accountability threatens the fragile self-structure. By reshaping the story, they avoid confronting their contribution to the breakdown. Second, it attempts to provoke you indirectly. If they cannot get a reaction from you privately, they may try publicly. Smear campaigns, selective disclosures, or exaggerated retellings are designed to pull you back into defense mode. Once you defend yourself, you re-enter the dynamic. Third, it restores perceived control. Controlling how others see you can feel like controlling you. Reputation becomes a proxy battleground. The more grounded your silence remains, the more extreme the narrative distortions can become. Not because you did something wrong, but because your non-participation forces them to construct a version of reality where they are still powerful, still justified, and still central. They may launch smear campaigns to provoke you because when direct access to you is cut off, they seek indirect routes to regain emotional control. In dynamics involving strong narcissistic traits, particularly patterns aligned with narcissistic personality disorder as described in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, reputation becomes currency. If they cannot control your reactions privately, they attempt to control how others perceive you publicly. A smear campaign is rarely loud at first. It often begins as concern, "I'm worried about them, they've changed, I tried so hard." These statements are crafted to position them as reasonable and you as unstable or ungrateful. The strategy is subtle character erosion. They plant seeds of doubt in mutual friends, family members, or colleagues. Over time, those seeds create confusion around your credibility. The goal is twofold. First, it restores their sense of superiority. If others validate their version of events, their fragile self-image feels reinforced. Second, it is bait. When you hear distortions about yourself, your instinct is to correct them, to defend your name, to explain your side. That reaction pulls you back into engagement, which restores their supply. Smear campaigns also serve as punishment for your silence. Your refusal to participate threatens their control, so damaging your reputation becomes a way to reassert dominance. It is an attempt to show that even if you disengage, they can still influence your social environment. The more you remain regulated and avoid reactive defense, the less fuel the smear campaign ultimately receives. These tactics thrive on visible distress and counterattacks. Without that reaction, the narrative eventually loses momentum, even if it feels intensely destabilizing in the short term. Silence exposes their dependency on validation because it removes the external reinforcement that props up their internal self-image. Individuals with strong narcissistic traits, particularly those consistent with narcissistic personality disorder as described in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, often construct a grandiose identity that requires constant feedback from the outside world. That identity may look confident, dominant, or self-assured, but it is frequently fragile and externally regulated. When you engage emotionally, whether through admiration, conflict, or distress, you confirm their significance. You reflect back to them that they matter, that they have impact, that they can influence your emotional state. That reflection stabilizes their sense of self. It helps them avoid feelings of inadequacy, shame, or emptiness that sit just beneath the surface. When you withdraw that reflection, the dependency becomes visible. Without your reactions, there is no immediate evidence that they are powerful or central in your life. Silence communicates indifference, and indifference is profoundly destabilizing to someone whose self-worth is built on being exceptional or dominant. It is not just about losing attention, it is about losing psychological confirmation. This is why silence often triggers intensified attempts at contact. The dependency on validation is not always conscious, but it is deeply embedded. They may seek admiration elsewhere, escalate provocations, or curate exaggerated self-presentations to compensate. The sudden need for visibility reveals how much their stability relied on your engagement. Your continued silence does not create their insecurity, it reveals it. By stepping out of the validation loop, you illuminate how dependent they were on your emotional responses to maintain their internal balance. Over time, silence strengthens your nervous system while weakening their control, because it interrupts the trauma-bonded feedback loop that kept the dynamic alive. In relationships marked by strong narcissistic traits, particularly patterns associated with narcissistic personality disorder, as outlined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the connection often operates on cycles of activation and relief. Conflict, tension, or devaluation triggers stress. Then comes intermittent reinforcement, brief validation, affection, or calm, which soothes the distress. That cycle conditions your nervous system to become hyper-attuned to them. When you choose sustained silence, especially emotional silence, you begin breaking that conditioning. First, your body may resist. You may feel anxiety, restlessness, or an urge to check your phone. That discomfort is withdrawal from a pattern your nervous system adapted to. Each time you resist reacting, you teach your body that the threat is not real, and that you can self-regulate without their input. Gradually, your baseline changes. You become less reactive to provocations. Your thinking becomes clearer. Instead of anticipating their mood shifts, you focus on your own internal state. Silence becomes less about punishment and more about protection. This strengthens emotional boundaries and restores a sense of agency. Meanwhile, their control weakens because control depended on your predictability and reactivity. If they cannot trigger you, they cannot steer the interaction. The longer you maintain regulation, the less leverage they have. What once activated you now loses intensity. Silence, sustained over time, rewires the dynamic at a physiological level. Your system stabilizes through consistency and self-containment, while their influence diminishes in the absence of emotional access. The longer you stay silent with a narcissist, the more the illusion cracks. Silence is not passive, it is not avoidance. It is the removal of emotional fuel from a system that survives on reaction. When you stop explaining, defending, arguing, and proving, you are not losing. You are stepping out of a rigged psychological structure. As the silence continues, they escalate, rewrite narratives, provoke, triangulate, and attempt to regain control. Not because you are cruel, not because you're wrong, but because your disengagement destabilizes the very mechanisms that once gave them power. Without your reactions, they are left with themselves, and that is the one confrontation they spend their lives trying to avoid. At the same time, something powerful, happens within you. Your nervous system begins to settle, your clarity returns, you start to see patterns instead of promises, you respond instead of react. What once felt urgent becomes obvious. What once felt confusing becomes predictable. And here is the truth. Silence does not change them. It reveals them. It reveals how dependent they were on your validation. It reveals how fragile their control actually was, and it reveals how strong you become when you no longer participate in the cycle. The longer you stay silent, the more the dynamic shifts. Their tactics grow louder, but your stability grows stronger. Their need intensifies, but your detachment deepens.